Why I believe that Tesla's special generator is intended to create the Hutchinson Effect, and why I believe the EV-Gray motor in the era of Richard Hackenberger, or did by Richard's design, something that Marvin Cole overlooked, according to McKay's analysis. So let's start with the EV-Gray motor. Marvin Cole created the Searle Effect, unbeknownst to himself, unforeseen by himself, and it freaked him out and he left research. The Searle Effect indicates that he was dealing with an electrostatic field, at the very least, which was not being put to use in some fashion. Maybe it was. Maybe the Hutchinson Effect was already in effect in the time frame of Marvin Cole's research, creating improved COP, coefficient of performance, within the parameters of the device that he was working on. But the levitation indicates to me that he is not he's not grounding out the electrostatic field. Part of the problem is we don't want to come under the ire of the FCC, and that might have been partly in his, at least Marvin Cole's subconscious tremulation, some kind of foreshadowing if he had kept it up, because a later edition of the EV-Gray motor did come under FCC violation, and that's when they went through the second raid. I think it was 1977, while the first raid was 74. It was just a few years later. The second violation had nothing to do with the DA trying to suppress, whatever. It just had to do with the FCC. They were creating radio interference in their local neighborhood. Well, this is why I think Tesla put iron so significant. 200 pounds of iron increases performance by 1 horsepower, because I made the supposition that the iron grounds out the electromagnetic field, the magnetic portion of the electromagnetic field, and I could be entirely mistaken. It could be a device intended to ground out the electrostatic field, either directly or indirectly, either by grounding out the magnetic field, thus to diminish the production of an electrostatic field as a consequence. But regardless, you've got this field of energy that we can say is electrostatic in the sense that there's no geometry to it. There's no circuitry making use of it. And we have to make sure that arcing does not occur, because arcing represents a circuit. And that would eliminate the Hutchinson Effect, because Hutchinson Effect is radio interference of 2 or more waves in an electrostatic field. Now, in an AC situation, that's the power factor, or the phase relation, I should say, between, power factor is a variable, an additional variable. The phase relation between the voltage portion of the AC sine wave and the current portion. It's split. If it gets split, then those are your 2 radio interference waves. And the electrostatic field in the later edition of the well, there were 2 stages of the EV-Gray motor under Richard Hackenberger. So Marvin Cole didn't ground out his electrostatic field, and so it had the property of anti-gravity, which is a waste, because he's trying to create an electric motor, which is acting as a generator producing over unity so that it can run itself. But so it's using principles similar to a Bedini energizer disc, because there's very little, if any, back EMF, because it's a very specially designed pulse DC motor. Be that as it may, it must have been exhibiting electrostatic properties, because we know about this, according to McKay, throughout its entire evolution. Not just the Marvin Cole portion. It's just that Marvin Cole didn't know what to do with it. He freaked out and he ran. It was quite a shock. But he didn't know about the Searle Effect. Searle Effect had already been discovered prior to Marvin Cole. So whoever gave them the information, EV-Gray liked to say Mr. Popov, Ivan Popov, or somebody, a little toy, which is kind of interesting, because the toy was a popping device, and Popov, popping, you kind of wonder if EV-Gray made it up. But whatever, Marvin Cole might have just stumbled across it, and EV-Gray made up a nice fantasy. because Marvin had left, so Evie Gray could say whatever he wanted to. Whatever. Be that as it may. Where was I? Oh dear. So Marvin Cole didn't know what to do with the extra energy. And it may have been arcing and sparking, or run the risk. So what did Tesla do in his special generator? He ran compressed air through the damn thing. Okay, so no arcing would have been possible. But he still made use of an excess of iron, as if to indicate that he's still trying to flush out the excess charge. Oh, wait a minute. If he's running compressed air into his device, where do you suppose it's going to go? It has to go somewhere. It could go into the air cabin space, the living quarters space, of the people running the Electro U-boat during the World War II. But it's still got to be vented out. The excess air has to be vented out the U-boat, unless they recompress it and fill their ballast tanks and use it in the course of their diving and sinking, which means they have to dive and sink periodically to exhaust their ballast tanks, because it'll get filled with the air. It's going to have nowhere else to go, but they'll have to vent it, which will give away their presence to anybody listening in with stereo headphones, or with aqua headphones. Ships topside in a ship, an enemy ship. So they're going to have this excess air. They're going to have to deal with it. But if it gets vented, let's just forget about that part, the incidents of war. If they're venting it into the living space, then the ions, this is the whole point of flushing that Richard Hackenberger learned. See, the earlier edition of the Richard Hackenberger variety of the Evie Gray motor was he dumped the excess electrostatic charge into a second bank of batteries, and he was blowing them up, because batteries need time, and if they don't get time, they boil, and they heat up, and they blow up. So time was a problem, because they didn't have time. They had to get rid of this electrostatic charge very quickly. So they learned to create the field between the chassis of the motor and, I think Mark McKay said, the rotor elements, or the foundation plates for holding the rotor. I can't remember. And then there's the airspace between them, and to eliminate the possibility of arcing, they flushed the air by running compressed air through the interior of the Evie Gray motor. And this got the ions out so that the ion pathways could not be built up to make arcing possible. Arcing would have brought in the FCC, I would imagine. And this is why Richard Hackenberger realized, I bet, if I have my timeline correct, my theorization according to the timeline, because I'm not looking at the timeline, so I'm not helping my memory. But what it's indicating is that the batteries not only were not doing the job, they were blowing up, but he was still getting a buildup of charge, creating arcing, which brought in the FCC Raid, the second raid. And so he learned to flush the air to prevent arcing, and then he didn't need the batteries, and he didn't bring on the ire of the FCC. So he learned how to control the wild stallion that Marvin Cole found exhibited as anti-gravity, the Searle Effect, and freaked out and didn't know. didn't want to deal with it. Plus he didn't believe in himself that he could deal with it. Yeah, that's why he freaked out. That's usually why we freak out. We don't believe we can deal with it. So we freak out. Emotional overload because of a choice. Charlie Lutz said, behind every emotion is a thought. Control the thought and you control the emotions. So if we make the wrong choice, then we freak out. We fail to make the right choice, let's put it that way. I can do this, I can deal with this. Just settle down and think. And this is what Richard Hackenberger had to do, because the FCC kind of pushed them. Come on now, deal with this. It was Mother Nature giving them a little push. Unfortunately, Richard Hackenberger died from pure exhaustion, because I guess Evie Gray was not the most efficient person to run, because he had a strong physiology, which he eventually burned out. But anyway, the stress, Evie Gray made everybody else stressed, except himself. Unless he was alone, then he stressed himself out, see. So his trick was to find somebody else to stress so he could be calm. So he stressed out He probably stressed out Marvin Cole. That's probably why Marvin Cole ran and freaked. and Richard Hackenberger died from a stroke, or whatever it was he died from. So E.V. Gray was the wrong person to live with, work with. Anyway, it's probably why he was a womanizer, to dump all that energy, see? Shows. He was an abuser. Not only of women, a user of women and an abuser of men. Oh, I hate to judge people. This is horrible. At least I'm wearing a shirt, right? I'm semi-clothed. So, in our version of Tesla's special generator, we will make use of Tesla's turbine, so that the rotating discs that I'm going to introduce shortly, because I'm not even trying to deal with the solid-state version, because I don't even know if one exists. I'm sure it does, but can't go there. So the rotating discs of the watt-hour meter that we're going to make use of in a slightly different fashion than the watt-hour meter to turn it into Tesla's special generator, because we know from William Line that from an email that I got from him during my correspondence with him, that the watt-hour meter is a degenerate form of Tesla's special generator. So we keep the rotating aluminum disc, but we change it, and we add an additional feature, and that is to turn the rotating disc into a Tesla turbine. And then we use 2 of Tesla's one-way valves with no moving parts. And we orient them opposites so that we have a linear flow of air coming into this thing to flush through and flush out the ions so that no arcing occurs, so that an electrostatic field builds up, and now maybe we can use the iron to draw off that electrostatic buildup and sink it somewhere into the iron, or into the into the iron as a magnetic field, so that it's no longer there as an electrostatic field to offer problems of buildup. Because it could be that when you've got compressed air in a confined situation of an electro U-boat, there's only so much air you can pump through. There's only so much air you need to pump through to run the reciprocating piston, because we don't have a rotating aluminum disc. So consequently, because of that limitation of airflow, we have to have the iron there. But if we have no limitation of airflow, we don't need the iron. You see, because now we go to Richard Hackenberger's version after the second raid, the FCC raid, because we have an abundance of air we're piping through this system to prevent arcing, which indicates that the electrostatic field is building up too much within the parameters of the geometry of the device. The 2 electrostatic poles are too close. You know, if we made it further away, it would be different. They're too close, and so we want to prevent arcing, so we flush an abundance of fresh air through the system. And we're not limited by the reciprocating version that William Line describes to us that the electro U-boats did make use of during the Nazi German World War II version of this special generator. So there's wiggle room, there's playing room in which we can change parameters so long as we know what we're doing. It's the Hutchison Effect. Okay? Now there are 2 versions of the Hutchison Effect, the AC version and the DC version. I've already hinted at the DC version, so let me reiterate in the prior video. The DC version is that we get a displacement between the magnetic field component of electromagnetics and the electric field component over time. One leads, the other follows, and we can flip it depending on the parameters of the geometric parameters of how we engineer this special generator, making use of aluminum and copper with regard to iron, which is our neutral point. Iron has ferromagnetic properties because the magnetic field and the electric field are in sync. But with aluminum it's displaced, and with copper it's displaced in opposite ways. And by knowing how to use the geometry of these 2 materials, or anything similar, analogous, if we can find something better, in Tesla's day, those were the 3 of choice. Some alloy, you know, because we know we can make use of a magnetic shielding that's more potent than iron. And it comes under various trade names, but it's like much more potent than iron alone. So if we can have an alloy that's more potent than pure aluminum, yet have the properties of aluminum magnified, and the same thing with copper along its lines, then we don't have to use strictly iron or strictly aluminum or strictly copper. We can come up with more efficient methods to raise the COP even higher. But we start out with the 3 pure metals because that's a good place to start. Now, I said that with aluminum I'm hypothesizing that the magnetic component of the electromagnetic field lags the electric field, which leads. But in the copper, the magnetic component leads and the electric field drags. I may have it backwards, for all I know, because as we know, we use copper in our wiring around an iron core to make an electromagnet. So our iron core is our reference, in which both the electric and the magnetic field are in sync. It would make sense that in the copper component of that situation, the magnetic field would lead and the electric field would drag. Why is that? Because the iron core is leading the coil, and the current generated is dragging behind. Because, right? Isn't that what it's doing? Well, let's think about this a minute. Actually, it has to do with the frequency of that coil. If it's an AC situation, let's say, because, or pulse DC, whatever, the iron is for lower frequencies, because if we want higher frequencies, like a so-called standard Tesla coil, then it has to be an air core coil. So the iron core is there for drag, is to slow down the magnetic field so it doesn't get too far ahead of the electric field. But in an air core situation, apparently what it means is the magnetic field can get so far ahead that we can have higher energy values because we can have higher frequencies. It tells us that higher frequencies represent higher energy values. Well, that would be energy regarding amperage, or the electric field component of a DC situation. And amperage, of course, is what we run everything off of. I mean, you have to have a minimum voltage to run it all, but it's the amperage component of watts that were being metered, not the voltage. Right? Because when we look at the development of the watt-hour meter, it's the amperage that gets ramped up. It's the amperage rating of the meter. You're not supposed to run your loads, your combined loads. See, the I-10 meter from 1912, the General Electric that I have in storage, was, I think, rated at 5 amps because they only expected you to run light bulbs off of it, you know? You didn't have a refrigerator compressor that hadn't been invented yet. And, you know, your power stereo, your subwoofers and your woofers. So it had very little load, and so the load is amperage. So it shows that my theorizing or hypothesizing so far seems to be self-consistent. That's the only thing I have to worry about. When I run off of inspiration, I have to be self-consistent. Okay, so it makes sense that the amperage. So I can assume, not referring back to the watt-hour, the Meter Man's Handbook, that amperage drags and voltage leads. I forget. See, there's a phase relation between them, and I forget which is which drags and which leads. But I would have to take a guess that it's the same as copper, exhibiting in a DC situation in which the electric field drags and the magnetic field leads. In an AC situation, the voltage would be leading and the amperage would be dragging. I could be wrong. Now that's in copper, because copper is what we use to make use of power in our systems. All our wiring is copper, and you know the grid saves half their copper by using the earth as one half of their one leg of their circuit, of their closed loop circuit, and the copper wiring is the other half. So what we do, let me paint you a picture here. I was going to use paper, but too lazy to. The armature, the structure of the I-10 meter from 1912 has a very interesting geometry. It has a back plate piece made out of cast iron in which the armature is set into, and has a little rim that goes over the edge of the armature. And the armature is toroidal, and it has, as I recall, one, sometimes you get figure 8 shaped transformer cores, but this one, the middle portion of the figure 8 doesn't go all the way across, as I recall. I could be wrong, but I think it only goes part way, and it's over that the voltage coil is wrapped, and that's thin wire, many turns. But it connects to the toroid at a T-shape, at a right angle. But as I recall, I think the amperage coil is just 2 or 3 turns of very stout wire along the toroid itself. And the connection to the circuit is similar. The voltage coil straddles the 2 leads, the 2 AC leads, while the current coil is in parallel. It's a shunt in parallel with one of those 2 leads of the AC hookup. Now, both those 2 coils are in the plane of the toroid, but they're at right angles to each other. One goes into the center, radially, into the center of the toroid, and the other goes tangential. The amperage coil is tangential to the toroid, while the voltage coil is at a perpendicular, radial to the toroid, but both in the plane of the toroid of the armature, the laminated armature. Now, the spinning disk of the watt-hour meter is perpendicular to all of that, and not in the center of the toroid, but out, surrounded by an aluminum shell in the shape of a ring, or the shape of a barrel. And then there's a glass faceplate, which is a dielectric. And then we have a braking magnet, a permanent magnet, C-shaped magnets, and the disc, the spinning disc, goes in between the 2 ends of that C-shaped magnet. And we're told if the braking magnet weren't there, that in the Meterman's Handbook from 1912, we're told that the disc will spin to infinity. And I think the glass plate is there for the same reason, to take away over unity. But there's a third element here: the orientation, the spin plane orientation of the spinning aluminum disc is perpendicular to the plane of the armature, the toroidal armature. It's perpendicular. Oops. Why do I think this? Because one of the videos I've been shown on YouTube, and I'll put the link down in the description, has to do with a very interesting experiment somebody did with a sheet of aluminum and 2 different magnets, 2 different neomagnets. One was a rectangular magnet in which the North Pole and the South Pole, it's a rectangular squat magnet. It's a very slender magnet in which the pole is on the greater surface area. So you got 2 squares and a very narrow distance between the 2 square faces, the north face and the south face. And so he could stand it on edge, and it turned as it slid down the aluminum face. And it turned depending on which way the north or in the south face were facing, which told me, besides the we got the lens effect when he had the other magnet sliding down. We see, oh yeah, the North Pole adheres to the aluminum sheet to a greater degree than the South Pole, but the South Pole does too. So it shows you there's a lens effect, but it's out of balance between the North and South Pole. But then he puts it on edge and it starts turning, And I forget which direction it turned in. It was either the South Pole or the North Pole, but regardless, it tells us that the electric field and the magnetic field is being reflected into a mirror image. There's the primary one, and there's a secondary one. And that's why Mr. Dort Jr. quoted his senior, his father, and relayed the quote to William Line, who then told us in Pentagon Aliens that aluminum is the reflector. Copper's the active, iron is the magnetic, but aluminum is the reflector because it's creating a clone of the electric field and a clone of the magnetic field, not as strong as the primary, a secondary set of fields, magnetic and electric fields, but at right angles to the primary. This is what it's doing. This is what aluminum is doing. It's a lens effect, but it's an interesting lens effect that only happens in aluminum, apparently, and not in copper, certainly, and definitely not in iron. And that's this secondary image that's at right angles to the primary. So what this is telling me is that we have to take our spinning aluminum disc in the water-meter and turn it, because it's at a perpendicular to the toroid, and make it parallel to the plane of the toroid. But not put it inside the interior of the toroid. Why? Because it's going to vibrate. And what is the nature of that vibration? It's precessional. What did William Line said? He said that when center of load was reached, the spinning disc stopped and vibrated, snored, he called it. That's telling me it didn't really stop. It's precessing. And it's the precession, all the force that would have gone to spin is now precessional spin, which is what the vibration constitutes. In which you get most of your force now along the axis, reciprocating. Ooh, you can go with that, can't you? And very little of it rotating or precessing, rotating in the form of a precession. So this might be the crux of the U-boat version of the reciprocating piston, is that it's a vibrating axis, spin axis, reciprocating spin axis of what would have been spin at right angles to the reciprocation. Okay? So that means it's reciprocating perpendicular to the plane of the toroid of the watt-hour meter, which is what causes the spin, because if you put it in the form of a disc, it's going to cause it to spin in a particular direction. And if you reverse your leads, it goes in the opposite direction. That's why I think there's something different about William Line's watt-hour meters that he used in that apartment experiment. Their spin plane is parallel to the armature rather than perpendicular to it. He said it's, any old watt-hour meter would do, it's the same. I can't figure out how he could do that experiment and get away with it. Because a normal watt-hour meter, if you swap the connections, nothing happens. Oh sure, it spins backwards, but you don't generate power. It just spins backwards. So the meter reader will come to your house and say, it's spinning backwards. But then he goes and looks at the connections. If they're not hidden, he says, oh, you've swapped them, duh. Because that's, the register will go backwards, but you don't generate power. Because I think this is what's going on, is that the spin plane of the aluminum disc is perpendicular to the armature plane. And so the reciprocating piston of the Nazi U-boat is being utilized to spin that disc, as opposed to vibrate it if it were parallel to the plane of the armature. So if we turn the spinning disc, we can't use it anymore, because it's going to snore. A very violent precession. It's going to vibrate or snore or precess. So now we have to turn it into a reciprocating piston. It ain't going to spin. Now, if we turn it into a pancake coil, an aluminum coil, insulated coil, that might be different. It's probably still going to shake, though, unless it's set into epoxy or something, or natural epoxy, not paraffin, not oil-based, not petroleum-based epoxy, but natural from living plant epoxy. All natural ingredients, living from living organisms that we know came from living organisms, not what they tell us. Oh, petroleum came from dinosaurs and ferns. Yeah, duh, that's lying. They're lying to us so as to get us to buy petroleum products because it loses its living factor, which augments the system and doesn't deaden it, doesn't drain it out and ground it out. See, paraffin is a great way to ground out your system and create underunity. And that's what insulation does. The rubber insulation on wiring, it grounds it out, so you get underunity. So we've got to come up with a manufacturing technique that comes up with natural, like latex. Rubber tree plant, natural rubber insulating wires, so we can get a gain rather than a loss. They've geared us for thinking about in terms of losses. Everything's losses, right. Everything. I've already dealt with this in a prior video. There's no such thing as a closed system. When I connect my car to a charging station, it's now an open system. So in the long run, there's always, even over time, everything is an open system. Everything is asymmetrical. Everything is either gaining energy or losing energy. It has nothing to do with the inefficiency of the system. It has to do with the asymmetry of the system, being open to its environment. Okay, so we've already covered that. There is such a thing as perpetual energy. It's called God. And there is such a thing as a perpetual motion device. It's called creation, being run by God. And creation is asymmetrical. It's open to God's input, so it runs forever. It just goes to sleep to eliminate stress periodically. So we've already covered that. Closed systems is a fabrication, artificial fabrication, and conceptualization of human mind, human intellect, to sell us this idea that we have to pay for our energy. When in reality all systems are open, no matter how they're designed, they have to be open, interacting with their environment. There is either losing energy or gaining energy, or a combination of both over time. Over time. It may be both and come out even. Anyway, so now I'm getting overheated. So in our analysis of Tesla's special generator, the reciprocating piston might be the only way to go. And a spinning disk may be indicative of a degenerate variety of Tesla's special generator. Of the variety that's moving parts. Now, my friend's coworker, it may have had moving parts in there, just nobody knew. Because if you've got a reciprocating piston vibrating above the frequency of human hearing, how are you going to know that it's not a solid state version? You'll just think it is. Scaled down to look like a notebook, But it may still have moving parts inside. Now, if we have a reciprocating piston, we're not going to have a Tesla turbine situation anymore, are we? Unless we bleed off just a little bit of that field, let's put it that energized field, let's put it that way, without designating what it is, by using a spinning stack of discs perpendicular to the armature, acting as a turbine to pump, to circulate air on the inside, and then we have two ports, both one-way Tesla valves, no moving parts, but each oriented in opposite direction with reference to the interior of the device so that air is flowing in one, out the other, and we're avoiding air buildup on the inside, ionic buildup, so that it doesn't reach plasma stage and create a channel, an ionic channel, for arcing to form and bleed out our field. So we might have to have both. A reciprocating piston maybe not. Maybe the reciprocating piston only works if you're driving it with compressed air. But if you're driving a spinning disc, now the disc has to be at a perpendicular to what would have been the reciprocating piston, which is now the axle of the reciprocating piston direction is the axle of the spinning disc. And now the spinning disc, now we stack them, multiple discs, to create a Tesla turbine to pump air through. And we take that braking magnet and we turn it into a pancake coil, sandwiched on either side of the spinning turbine to act as a pickup coil to handle our load. But now we still have to have energy to drive the armature. If it's driving this thing, creating the field. But if the electrostatic buildup is sufficiently charged enough without arcing to loosen it, and we play with the so-called phase relation, or power factor, whatever it's called, between our two relations, if it's a DC situation between the magnetic field and the electric field, if it's AC between the voltage portion of the sine wave and the amperage portion of the sine wave, if we play with that, we play with these different factors, then we may be able to get over unity and self-run the thing. Now it's not self-starting, so we have to have some outside source start the thing. And if load should vary too much, this is why I think all the pole transformers are grounded. It isn't just to prevent lightning strikes from imbalancing, causing drastic changes in the characteristics of the power grid such that it would brown out or even dead out, blacken out. But what if people's load should change? Everybody decides, okay, we're going to turn off all our devices. That could damage the balance of load in the power grid such that we could have a brownout or even a blackout. And so I think partly the reason why they ground out all those pole transformers is to somewhat stabilize the variation of the load in the power grid so that it doesn't brown out or black out as likely as it might if they didn't do that, if they didn't ground out each pole transformer. Now, I'm not sure how the grounding wire that's leading down from the pole transformer is connected to the transformer, though, so I'm just hypothesizing here. But there is a grounding wire from each pole transformer. Washington State, they have all their electric grid above ground for some reason, and not below ground. And so the power is always going out once a year when all the conifers are busy swinging in the wind and downing a line. You go without power for several hours. And apparently there was a copper plate underground that grounding wire is linked to at the bottom of the pole, the telephone pole that's holding up the pole transformer. So the grid may be not set up for over-unity, but because all systems are open, we have to take into consideration that the principles of over-unity are used all the time. It's just not maximized to create an over-unity setup. Now, I've read somewhere that there's such a thing called karma, and that there's such a thing as sociological karma, collective karma, and it could be that if we had a society running on over-unity all the time, that might explain the Dark Ages in between each cultural rise. Because when you think about it, technology itself is over-unity. The principle of the lever, Archimedean, the lever, is already over-unity right there. And so karmically already, just by using the lever alone, which is gears, when you've got gears stepping up, just like a transformer transforms a voltage and amperage. You use the amperage, you don't use the voltage. So already the AC transformer is the principle of the lever. So every time we use the lever, we're creating karma. Culture is flourishing, but then we get the Dark Ages in between. So we literally are going to have to rise above our karma at some point. Raise our consciousness so that we don't have to have technology making use of karmic costs at the expense of our consciousness. In other words, the principle of yoga must not die out, because the whole point of yoga is to keep augmenting, increasing our consciousness, improving our karma. So that, yeah, we get lulls, but they're not as bad as the prior ones until finally they don't affect our overall consciousness. They're there, but they don't affect us in an adverse fashion. They don't affect our consciousness or the expression of our consciousness or the behavior of our nervous system in an adverse fashion. But it's something we have to take into consideration. We're using the principle of the lever to leverage our way, using technology, to leverage our way through our culture so that things are easier, more convenient. But we set up karma, we set up dark ages. At some point it's going to collapse if yoga, the pursuit of improving our consciousness, does not keep pace with the pursuit of technology, the pursuit of the lever, the use of the lever to make life more interesting and more, casual, more convenient, more effortless. That's nice, but we pay for it at a cost. And if we don't put money in the bank, karma, by meditating twice a day, then all we're doing is spending it. By having this influx of technology, spending that karma of our conscious development, causing the inevitable to happen, the collapse of society, of culture, the collapse of culture to happen eventually, and the dark ages to ensue, another dark ages. Not as bad as the last one, hopefully, because when the Roman culture collapsed, we had dark ages. The Chinese had their cultural rise. Everybody had it. And then when everybody had the dark ages in between. Yet not everybody had dark ages, because we had cultures we don't even know about, like the South American one. If you study, Terra something, in which they take charcoal rather than ash and use it as a fertilizer. And what's it called? Damn it. Sorry. Bio something. Yeah, it's a very, very advanced form of composting in which you use charcoal, not ash, and not living plant matter, but you use the in-between, charcoal, and it creates a biological matrix in the soil that's so advantageous that it becomes truly living soil that literally regenerates itself. And there was a whole culture based on that, apparently, of gazillions of people who disappeared. But they were living in the floodplains of the, river that goes through the Amazonian rainforest? The Andean River? No. I can't remember the name of it. Oh, damn, my memory's not too good. Anyway, they were living in the floodplains of that river that goes through the Amazonian rainforest, and they just disappeared, but they were using charcoal to fertilize their soil, and this is where the discovery was made of this new kind of soil, composting technique. So we have this technology, but if we don't improve our consciousness, we spend out the karma, we drain out the karma that created all that nice technology that we're living on, and the whole of society, the whole of our culture collapses, and we go through a dark ages. People get wiped out. The whole culture gets wiped out. So it's good to keep in mind. We can, create our devices and have free energy, but you don't practice yoga, you don't do something to raise your consciousness, you're not going to be helping your culture survive to continue to, generation after generation, to live off the benefits of so-called free energy over unity. And this was what was missing in the Marvin Cole, Evie Gray, Richard Hackenberger triangle of those three people. They had some consciousness, some grace, but not enough to reach us, the consumer. And we didn't have enough to support them. So we're just as guilty as they are. We're all guilty for what we lack. So we didn't have enough to bring it to market, but then you got to worry about sustaining it over time. The consciousness to sustain it over time. So you see, either way you shake it, there's grace that's missing. Good karma. And it's not all about religion. Yoga does talk about religion, the do's and don'ts, but that's all religion deals with. unless we go back to the followers of Christ before the two councils of Nicaea, they had techniques that Christ gave to a few of his followers, not to the masses, because that wasn't his purpose, to give techniques to the masses. His purpose was to teach a new law of love, love your enemy, and to cast out demons. That was a side effect, a bad side effect, of conducting a lifestyle of revenge, which the Jews were doing at that time. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So he did give techniques. We know this because Peter used it to heal people. I've used the word, and look what's happened. Wow, it's startling. This gal is healed. Just like Christ said it would work. It worked. The Spirit came over me, I used the word, and it worked. Well, he was practicing sanyama, which Patanjali talks about. 3 of the 8 limbs of yoga to produce sanyama, to produce results, technological results. This is what technology does. It makes use of sanyama, whether you know it or not. Patanjali talked about it. But you've got to have pure consciousness, you've got to have meditation, you've got to have a thought to create sanyama. And when you have sanyama, then you have technology that actually works for a limited duration based on your pure consciousness to keep it going, along with the other 2 components to keep it going, meditation and the thought, the correct thought. That's the knowledge we're taught, what we talk about, like on YouTube and, all these videos. All we're talking about is knowledge, the information, the thought. We're not talking about the meditation, we're not talking about pure consciousness, so we shouldn't overlook those 2 components. If all we do is think about knowledge and information, all we need is the right knowledge and we can create over unity. You need meditation and the pursuit of yoga, meditation, and you need pure consciousness, the experience of samadhi, pure consciousness, transcendental consciousness, the 4th state. Or else you're going to lose the technology or never get it in the first place. It'll never work. So you see, you need sanyama for culture to be based on high-end technology, to be effortless and convenient and high-quality standard of life. 3 of the 8 limbs of yoga, which have nothing to do with 2 of those, 2 more limbs, yama and niyama, things to do and things to avoid doing, which has been to date the sole or the exclusive, the only domain of religion. Then there's hatha yoga, exercise, right? Oh, we know about that now. We exercise. Okay, that's hatha yoga. And diet, hatha yoga. That's exercise. Okay. So that's another limb of yoga. So we've covered 3 plus 3, that's 6. That only leaves 2 left over. I wonder which 2 those are. I forget. If I got it right. If I got my limbs of yoga correct. Ashtanga, the limbs. They're not steps of yoga. They're limbs. And a full, robust society would pursue all 8 limbs and not leave any of those 8 stones unturned. If you want to have a robust culture that survives time and does not wear itself down due to oversight. Oops, we forgot a limb or 2 or 3 or 4. Before you know it, we forgot all of them. We're back in the dark ages. So you see, yoga's behind all of this. Ultimately, yoga's behind all of this pursuit of free energy. In the big scheme of things, hey, you want to take it to market, how are you going to get it there? I had a problem I read about. It wasn't my problem, but I made it my problem. The farmers had this problem in the late 70s. They had their baby carrots and their specialty vegetables. They couldn't bring it to market because there was no consumer demand. I read about it in Rodale Press, Organic Gardening and Farming magazine when I was going to school in Iowa. And I thought, okay, I'm leaving school because of low grades. They're kicking me out for a semester, and I ended up staying out. But I started a business selling sunflower greens all over L.A., any which way I could, on consignment. I lost more money than I made. For the sole purpose to raise people's consciousness, to let them know there are choices out there they don't know about, and they should start demanding those choices. And you know what? It worked. It put more variety in the supermarkets. Now it's established, because I got out of the business. The Kowalski brothers went in and took my place. They were growing alfalfa sprouts in the Topanga Canyon area, producing them for, retail or wholesale or both. So they swooped in, took over, and then the whole gluttony of variety has now just blossomed, mushroomed, of organic vegetables you can get, and fruits you can get in the normal markets, and meat substitutes, vegan meat substitutes. You can get all kinds of food products. At that time, you were lucky to find wheatgrass and only in a health food store. And you were lucky to get Loma Linda in a can, gluten, wheat gluten in a can, Loma Linda in a can, canned gluten. Can you imagine canned meat substitute in a can? You know, that's all we had. So I went around with my sunflower greens on consignment, and eventually people stopped ignoring them, and they stopped wilting on the produce aisle, and I had to keep resupplying what they threw out every week. And finally, one week at Vicente Foods on Vicente Boulevard in West LA by the VA, you know, over there in West LA by the 405, the VA hospital and the VA whatnot complex. There's Vicente Foods. It's not a chain. It's a single market. And between one week and the next, I saw the transition. A lady walked right past the wilting sprouts, the sunflower greens, and people were willing to buy it. And then the following week, they were empty. And she was demanding, where are my sprouts? Because they wanted them, even though they had hulls still on them, because I couldn't remove the hulls. I didn't know how to. These were the sunflower seeds used for making oil. It's tastier variety when you sprout them. You don't use the ones for confectionery eating, because those are bitter when you sprout them. They're even bitter sometimes when you eat them raw, made into sunflower butter. So I sprouted them, the hulls were still there, and they were willing to buy them. And go to the trouble of removing the hulls and putting them in their salads. And they started becoming in demand. So this is what I had to do. I had to spark consumer awareness, to spark consumer interest, to create consumer demand, to draw from the supply, because the farmers had these specialty vegetables, but there was nobody buying them. So I became the tipping point, simply by raising consumer awareness. And that's all I'm trying to do by talking here. But I'm telling you, it's an 8-point plan, Ashtanga Yoga. You got to take care of all the limbs if you want to get it to market, improve consumer awareness, and sustain it over time, so you don't have a culture that uses it for a few centuries or a few millennia. In the case of Atlantis, it was many millennia. But eventually, you know, people forget about the 8 limbs of yoga and the need to pursue all 8 in order to sustain a culture over time, to have that high quality of life over time. So I'm just telling you in advance. Forgetfulness eats away at our culture. Well, we don't need to. Everything's good enough the way it is. And then nobody puts their attention on keeping things running. Oh, it's running all by itself. Well, yeah, you've got the devices so well made, like Tesla claimed it could be. Oh, his generator will run for 5,000 years. Well, then you don't have to service it, and then you don't have to service your culture, and then the whole thing starts to die out, because you get born with generations that are lazy and don't bother to keep things running in the various aspects, all 8 limbs of yoga. It supports the culture. It supports culture. It's the whole point of the 8 limbs of yoga is to support culture, to support a high quality of life over time. Because you don't just think about the do's and don'ts. Those are just 2 of the limbs of yoga. And you don't just think about technology. That's the one of knowledge that science puts its attention on. And you don't just think about, let's meditate and transcend, which are 2 more limbs of yoga. That's nice. They're very important. They're the most important. But they're the 6 other to express the benefits and give us the high quality of life based on that consciousness that we've raised during meditation, that we've experienced the transcendental state during meditation. So those 2 limbs, the meditation and samadhi. So it's interesting that yoga has a lot to do with science and technology. And religion has something to do with our quality of life, because those are 2 of the limbs of yoga. If we ignore the followers of Christ before the Council of Nicaea, you know, because they had techniques, so they were able to do something more than just have the do's and don'ts to live by. They could actually meditate. And we know from monks that they know, you know. That's why we had flying monks, you know, flying nuns stories, Christian saints, you know, who flew around. There was something going on there. And it wasn't just do's and don'ts. It was a little something more. It was sanyama. three more limbs. So meditation, the thought, and the experience of samadhi. Anyway, covered a lot of ground here. How long is this video? Ooh, it's almost an hour. It's going to shut up if I don't shut up, so I'm going to shut up first.